All right, so we're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff today, right?
Yeah.
You sent over the story of the Tower of Babel, and
Yeah.
I think it's a story that a lot of people have heard of,
Oh, yeah.
maybe bits and pieces.
Yeah.
And we're going to really kind of unpack it and understand what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those stories that's been kind of, if you will, like repurposed in a lot of different ways. And so it's important for us to go back to the original
Right.
and really try to understand it in its context.
Yeah, so what's the kind of mission here? We want to understand, who are the main players, what are their motivations, what actually happens when this whole tower project gets underway, and then what are the lasting implications? Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, that's a great overview. I think we need to put it in its place in the biblical narrative. So we've had creation, we've had the fall, we've had the flood.
Yeah.
Now, the descendants of Noah, all speaking the same language, they journey to a plain in the land of Shinar, and that's where we're going to pick up the story.
All right, so, one thing I noticed in kind of preparing for this is that it talks about how, Adam and Eve and, Abel and Seth and all these, early figures.
Right.
They all seem to have this very clear understanding of who God is,
Yeah.
that he is the creator and he is all-powerful.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on that, they understood him to be righteous, holy, loving, merciful,
Right.
all-powerful, and utterly self-sufficient. So he doesn't need anything from them or from us.
Yeah, and it seems like somewhere along the line it kind of gets lost.
That's right.
So this de-godding of God that your sources talk about, what did that look like?
Yep.
How do they start to change their perception?
Well, it's subtle, but it's
Yeah.
profound. So they, instead of acknowledging a God who needed nothing,
Right.
they increasingly focused on themselves
Okay.
and began to remake God in their own image. They started to imagine a deity who had needs and wants that humans were responsible for fulfilling. And furthermore,
Okay.
they began to perceive this deity as one who didn't communicate clearly, perhaps even as hostile or even potentially damaging, if not appeased.
So almost like a more, a negotiable God.
Yeah.
Like you could, control or influence by
Exactly.
what you do.
Yeah, as if he was susceptible to manipulation and that he had limited power,
Yeah.
as opposed to being all-powerful and that he was prone to anger if not properly cared for.
Right.
This is a profound departure from that earlier understanding of God as being inherently good
Okay.
and all-powerful.
So this de-godding, it's not just, some theological idea.
Right.
It really leads into, the building of the Tower of Babel.
Absolutely.
This is kind of their project.
Yes. This is their way to God, as it were.
Right.
And so it's a human-engineered approach in contrast to their ancestors who recognize God as the ultimate authority and the one who initiates.
Right. So let's actually get into the story here. We've got Genesis 11.3 to 4. And I'm going to read this here. It says, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly."
Right.
And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." I mean, when you read that, what
Got it.
jumps out at you there?
Yeah, a couple of things jump out to me. First, the repeated "let us."
Right.
That emphasizes a kind of unified human initiative apart from God.
Right.
Secondly, their stated goals are very revealing. They want to build a city
Yes.
and a tower, but critically to make a name for themselves.
Okay.
So this is a prioritization of human pride and ambition over honoring God. And finally, they want to establish a central point to avoid being scattered.
Right. Like, we got this.
Right.
We don't need you to tell us to spread out.
Exactly. They're defying the earlier command to fill the earth.
Yeah, and this tower with its top in the heavens,
Yeah.
Was this literal? Were they actually trying to build high enough to reach God?
Well, the text allows for a couple of interpretations. It could have been literal,
Okay.
that they wanted to physically reach the dwelling place of God.
Okay.
However, it's also plausible that heavens simply refers to the sky, signifying an incredibly tall tower that symbolizes their power and unity. And I think here it's helpful to consider the historical context
Okay.
of the ziggurat.
Okay, the ziggurat.
Yeah, you're familiar with that.
I've heard of it. I don't know a lot about it.
Yeah, so ziggurats were stepped pyramids
Okay.
with stairways leading to a temple
Okay.
at the summit, which was believed to be a gateway of the gods.
Okay. A place where deities could descend
Okay.
to receive offerings, rest, and worship in the temple below.
So are you saying then that, maybe they were trying to build something similar to that?
Yeah. perhaps consciously or unconsciously,
Okay.
they were attempting to facilitate interaction with God on their own terms.
Like, we'll build you a place and you can come down here.
That's right. And this underscores that de-godding that we talked about.
They are trying to diminish the God who created through his word
Right.
and designated humans as his representatives.
Mhm.
Instead, they envision a deity who needs their provisions and
Right.
their direction.
Right, like a small God.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so we got this tower going up, and then God shows up.
That's right.
And we see here in Genesis 11:56, it says, "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people were building.
Right.
The Lord said, if, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them." What's the big takeaway here?
Well, it's important to recognize that God acknowledges
So-
humanity's incredible potential.
Okay.
They're made in his image with
Okay.
intellect and creative capacity.
Yeah.
He sees that their unity, combined with their shared language,
Okay.
allows them to accomplish almost anything.
Oh, yeah.
However, in this context,
Okay.
that potential is being misused. It's directed towards rebellion against his will
Right.
and his plan for humanity to spread out.
So it wasn't so much that they were building a building.
Exactly.
It was the motivation behind it?
It was their unified defiance against God's purposes.
Right.
So God wasn't threatened by their skills or their ability to work together,
Okay.
but by the fact that they were unified
Right.
in opposing him.
And so he has to take action.
Right.
And we see that here in Genesis 11:7. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other.
Right.
Wow, what an intervention.
Quite a dramatic intervention.
What happens? What's the immediate result of that?
Genesis 11:8 says, "So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city."
Wow.
So the very unity that they were striving for is shattered, and they're scattered.
Yeah, they're scattered, which is what they were trying to avoid.
That's right.
Now, let's talk about the name Babel for a second.
Yeah.
Because there's some really interesting, kind of wordplay going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the Babylonian language, Babylon means gate of the gods.
Okay.
But in the biblical Hebrew, the word Babel
Okay.
sounds very close to the word Balal, which means to confuse.
Right.
So it's like there's this built-in,
It's like a joke almost.
yeah, almost like a commentary.
Yeah.
Their gate of the gods
Okay.
has become a symbol of confusion.
Wow. I mean, God does come down,
He does.
but not the way they expected.
Not the way they expected at all.
He's coming down in judgment.
That's right.
So then the narrative shifts pretty dramatically.
Yeah.
We go from this huge, global event to this very specific, genealogy of Shem.
Right. Genesis chapter 11.10:26, we have the lineage of Shem, and it's what's called a linear genealogy.
Yeah.
Unlike the genealogy of the nations in Genesis 10,
Right.
this one traces a very direct line from Shem all the way to Abram.
So like one branch of the family tree.
That's right. And the significance is this: it highlights a specific relationship with God.
Okay.
In fact, the text refers to the Lord, the God of Shem, which kind of foreshadows that incredibly significant later designation, the God of Abraham.
Okay.
So this genealogy is highlighting a line of promise, a thread that connects to God's plan of redemption.
And it mentions a guy named Peleg.
Oh, yeah.
And, I've read through this before, but this time I was like, wait a minute, his name means division.
Exactly.
And it says, in his days, the earth was divided.
Yeah.
That connecting back to Babel.
Yeah. The text strongly implies that the division during Peleg's time is a direct reference to the scattering after Babel.
Wow.
So his very name
Yeah.
is a reminder.
Like a marker in history.
Exactly.
That's so interesting.
It's fascinating.
So we had this genealogy in chapter 11, and then, earlier in Genesis chapter 5, we had the line from Adam to Noah.
That's right.
Any big differences in the way those are presented?
There are some interesting differences. So both give the ages of the fathers when their sons are born and their lifespans.
Right.
However, Genesis 11 doesn't explicitly mention anyone's death. Unlike Genesis 5, which repeatedly uses the phrase, "and he died."
Right.
So the focus in Genesis 11
Oh, yeah.
isn't on the inevitability of death,
Right.
but rather on tracing the lineage that leads to Abram,
Okay.
who will play a pivotal role in God's plan to bless the world.
Right. And we see in Genesis 11:26, it lists Terah's sons,
Uh-huh.
Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
Yeah.
But it seems like maybe they're not listed in birth order.
Yeah, that's possible, and it's an important detail because
Okay.
it helps us to accurately understand the chronology of events.
Okay.
So while it says that Terah lived 70 years and fathered these sons,
Right.
this doesn't necessarily mean that Abram was born when Terah was 70.
Okay.
Looking
Yeah.
at later passages, it seems more likely that he began having children at 70.
Right.
But Abram was born when Terah was around 130 years old.
Yeah, so not the firstborn.
Possibly not.
Right, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, the main point is that Abram is in the line.
Okay.
That's what's important.
Okay.
So the genealogy serves to highlight Abram's significance.
So big picture, what are some of the, biggest takeaways from this story of the Tower of Babel and then this genealogy?
Well, the central theme that runs through this is humanity's desire to redefine God
Okay.
and the consequences that result from that.
Right.
We see at Babel a united humanity with immense potential,
Right.
but they misuse it.
Yeah.
They're striving for self-glorification.
Right.
They're defying God.
Yeah.
And so God has to intervene not to stifle their potential,
Okay.
but to redirect it
Okay.
by disrupting their unity.
Yeah.
And then as far as the lasting impact, I think the Tower of Babel explains the diversity of languages.
Right.
It explains why we're all scattered.
Yeah.
And some have even suggested that it might mark the beginning of various forms of pagan religion
Okay.
as these groups take their distorted ideas about God with them.
Right. Okay, so Babel is about this desire to, make a name for themselves,
That's right.
to make their own way to God.
Yeah.
And it backfires.
Yeah. Big time.
God intervenes.
He does.
And the story shifts to this very specific line
Right.
that leads to Abram.
Yes.
And that's going to be huge going forward.
Absolutely.
It's all leading to this.
Yeah.
And I think for you, the listener, thinking about this, what are some ways that we might still be tempted to redefine God
Yeah.
or to redefine, truth to make it fit,
Right.
what we want?
Yeah. Exactly.
Sure.
Are we tempted to reshape those ultimate realities to make them more palatable,
Right.
more in line with our desires? And what
Right.
are the consequences of that?
Even if we're not building a giant tower.
Right. It may not look like Babel,
Yeah.
but it's the same principle.
It's the same heart.
It is.
Wow, that's a lot to think about.
And also think about unity
Okay.
and communication and how powerful those things are.
Right.
And also how, when they're disrupted,
Yeah.
it can really change the course of history.
Like it did at Babel.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It has been fascinating.
Absolutely. And we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.